All right, hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for this week's Snacking Chat, Adopt for Life's weekly Facebook Live, where we explore the topics that are top of mind for families formed by adoption, kinship, and customary care. My name is Chantal Genova. I'm the community Adopt for Life. All month we have been having conversation about why language matters. And I hope you'll take part in today's Snack and Chat, whether you're watching live or on replay. So I just got a notification that my internet is unstable. So hopefully you can still hear me and see me. And hopefully that issue resolves itself soon. So I'm going to take a moment to properly or officially introduce our guest, Cheyanne Ratnam. She has dedicated much of her time and expertise in child welfare and homelessness. She is the Youth and Care Impact Manager at the North Pine Foundation, co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition, OCAC, and she is a provincial representative on the National Council of Youth and Care Advocates. She serves on the board of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto as Vice Chair, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board Lead, on the board of Scarborough West Community Legal Clinic, on the Association of Community Legal Clinics of Ontario's Race Equity Working Group, and is an engagement specialist consultant for various projects across Canada. Cheyanne is also an advocate regarding childhood sexual abuse and GBV, IPV, and a survivor of both herself. She is an independent consultant through her private business, Cheyanne Ratnam Consulting and Services, a capacity builder, public speaker, ambassador of the Children's Aid Foundation of Canada, and partakes in various and diverse communities through voluntary roles. In 2016, she was the recipient of the prestigious One to Watch Alumni Award, awarded by her alma mater. In 2017, she was recognized by the United Way of Greater Toronto as one of 3 women who inspire International Women's Day. I hope you'll help me and welcome Cheyanne. We are just thrilled to have her here because obviously she's a very busy lady. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And also for those of you that are watching, whether you're watching live or on replay, we appreciate you taking your time to join us. Feel free to ask questions or put in a comment, let us know that you're watching. We hope that you enjoy today's discussion. So thanks again, Cheyanne. I think I froze there for a second, but I think I'm all right now. Awesome. So like I said, so great to see you. This is like your 3rd time on Snack and Chat. I was kind of thinking it was kind of funny because behind the scenes when we're at work, we don't say Snack and Chat. We always abbreviate to SNC. So I feel like you're like alumni on SNC now. So we have a lot of questions, so we're just going to jump right to it. And today's focus is all about words and language. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on the subject matter. So we're going to start with the term or word, let's say, foster child, or we hear either foster child versus saying a child in a foster care system or even foster parent. And this industry and culture has been using this term for over 100 years. And given now what we know now about child development, self-esteem, identity formation, is it time to just stop this word in its tracks or not? And what do you think about that and why this word and term has stayed with us for so long?
I mean, that's an interesting question because at the end of the day, terminology is a form of power. and terminology is developed to differentiate the other and differentiate differences. And so the language stuck around for so long because people wanted to differentiate between, quote unquote, and I'm not saying this as like I use this language, but like normal family, structures and kids versus institutionalized children. And so for institutionalized children, they have various labels that are forced upon them, such as foster kid, foster child, care leaver, adoptive kid, like whatever that looks like, it's there. Having said that, because language is power, terminology is power, I think that the better question is who decides what young people are labeled as or identified as? Is it the system? Is it other young people? Is it the young person themselves? And for me, the answer is each young person will have their own journey. And it's very important to have an intersectional lens when you talk about language, when you talk about power, when you talk about privilege, when you talk about intersectionality and how intersectionality impacts young people's experiences and expertise while they navigate through the child welfare system and their various placements. Are their placements stable? Are they permanent? Is there permanency within foster care? I would say that permanency is a fallacy. Permanency exists in different ways for different people, but the overall traditional definition of permanency doesn't necessarily exist for a lot of people in the child welfare system. And so for me, it's not the question of, whether we should do away with this terminology or not. The question is, are you asking the right person in terms of how they would like to be identified as? And so the question should actually be redirected to the young person to say, how would you like to be called? Or just like observe them, right? Some young people, for example, if you have an intersectional lens, we know that within the child welfare system, there's a lot of placements that aren't necessarily aligned with young people's ethnicities and races as well, right? And so let's say you are, and I'm Jaffna Tamil from Ilangay, which is the Tamil word for Sri Lanka. There's probably not a lot of placements with people and families that are from my culture. And maybe the young person also does not want to be placed with someone in their culture too because of trauma, right? So also make sure you're asking the young person where they would like to be placed as well. And instead of assuming where they should be placed. But let's say I was placed in a white Caucasian centric home. Maybe a part of me would like to just be called their kid. But then maybe depending on where I was in my identity journey, maybe I wouldn't want to be called their kid. Maybe I do want to just say, like, differentiate myself and say I'm a foster kid, especially if I've had multiple placements and I've been taken from one placement to another and I'm very institutionalized. So it really depends on the young person and really exploring with them what makes sense. And just because they choose to identify themselves as one thing one day doesn't mean that 2 days from now or a year from now, they're going to identify the same way. So it's an ongoing conversation, just like consent. Consent is never official. It's never one all and be all. The minute that you say you're going to consent to something, consent is an ongoing process, is an ongoing conversation. And the same thing should happen when it comes to language. And if you really understand how language has power, privilege, and the impact to marginalize and oppress people, to have more open conversations that are authentic and meaningful to each young person that they encounter. I know that was a long-winded answer, but I hope that was okay.
That was amazing. I love that. And I love that, to put the onus on whether it's somebody who's working in the field or whether it's a parent or to take that power and give it and shift it to the child and have those open conversations. And like you say, ongoing. It's not just the one time, okay, you want to be addressed as this and you can never change your mind again. That applies to so many aspects of a person's life because we're constantly navigating our journey and changing, right?
And I think also, like, if you look at, I'm going to make a reflection and connect this into another sector, for example. So if you look at the disabilities and differently abled communities, right? There's a double-edged sword, If you have a label, you get the right supports. If you don't have that label, it's very hard to receive those supports because you're systemically oppressed and violated. Just because you're differently abled. And so even if you look at the child welfare system, you could kind of similarize that to that experience. to say, okay, well, if I identify as being a former foster kid or a foster child, I might get a scholarship for school. If I don't identify this, I might miss out on a scholarship too. So it's really the same language can shift in use in different spaces and different contexts. So you might want to, as a child, you might want to elevate that language, that label, that identity in some spaces. And then in other spaces, it's like, no, I'm just a kid. That's my family, right? So it could fluctuate in itself as well. And that's why we say language is power, because you mute it in some spaces, you elevate it in other spaces. In other spaces, it's kind of a mix of both, right? Depending on who's in that space and how you engage with that space yourself.
I love that. And I thank you for making that point, because that it's a great point to make, and we don't want to forget that those people that need access to certain services will need to raise that voice and raise that. So I'm going to bring up another another term that we sometimes hear from youth themselves, or whether it's within the child welfare industry. The term is aging out. So please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. Aging out, referring to the transition time when youth are leaving care due to their age, this cutoff age. So now you, in fact, came up with this ethical reset language, talking about readiness indicators instead of age-based indicators. So, and you also, with OCAC, as part of your other role and founder of OCAC, you partnered with other organizations and taking on the work at the provincial level, partnering with the government. So all that to say, another term, is this a term that should be, again, phased out, or is it, again, just like we talked about in the previous question, just opening it up and making it part of the conversation, directing it back to the youth and asking them, what type of language do you want to use when you're referring to your own journey?
So this is an interesting question, because this is more systemic. This is a systemic issue. Young people in the child welfare system are violated by the systems, they're oppressed by the systems, and they're underserved by the systems. They are forced into overrepresentation as well if they come from specific populations because of systemic issues. And so this aging out is language of violence. That's how I would explain it. Because you almost, when you think about aging out, it's almost like a voluntary thing. It sounds voluntary, but there's nothing voluntary about aging out. This is systemically induced forcing of young people into the community when they're not ready. And also, you know, aging out language almost gives this illusion that the parent, which is the crown or the province or the nation that is the parent to the young person, now has less accountability to this young person because they're aging out of a system. But if you look at families are families for the rest of their lives when they're not institutionalized. And so there should be an accountability framework and responsibility of the crown to make sure that they still prioritize young people regardless of their age, and also acknowledge that, you know, if they do, or let me rewind for a second, right? Like the new framework that we're working on in the province is readiness based. And what I mean by readiness based is that a child or a young person is working on building their capacity in order to be able to have not just the basic minimum capacity skills or knowledge to be able to survive in the community, but also really strengthening that type of capacity building so that they're also able to think about dreaming and thriving. Our population, we're conditioned to never dream big. We're not conditioned to thrive. We have been taught to survive. Sorry, those are my dogs in the background wrestling with each other. Stop. So anyways, yeah, so we are conditioned to not to dream. We are conditioned to survive. And that's why even for financial literacy, we're taught to open up a bank account and budget, but we're not taught anything else that would relate to expanding ourselves and building generational wealth, because generational wealth is not attached to us as a family class of people from the child welfare system who has the guardian of the government being our guardian, right? So it's a very different process. And so aging out language should be eradicated. That system needs to be erased, and it should be replaced everywhere across Canada, not just Ontario where this work is happening, but everywhere across Canada where the system and framework itself should be replaced and restructured and renewed as a readiness-based system so that every single person has their divergent needs met. And then also every single person has the opportunity to gauge their capability to thrive in the community and survive in the community as well. And so for me, it's about exiting the system. It's not even about exiting the system because that's still age-based right now, but it's more so about when you're ready, here are your options. But then let's say you're not ready yet to the full extent, what are some other options that you have? So what are some transitional options that you have if you don't want to be in the current placement that you're not thriving in, that you don't want to stay in? In the non-institutionalized communities out there, when a young person moves out and they're unable to be independent, oftentimes they're able to come back home, wherever that home is, to their family. But for our population, that's not true. And so part of the readiness system that we're kind of creating and that we're pushing for in this province, and also nationally by supporting my other counterparts across the nation, is so that if a young person does feel ready at 18, of course, you could move out at 18, but if they're not ready to move out, then they have other options, whether it's to stay in their current placement or have a transitional option in place. And then if they do exit, they make that choice to be independent in the community and it doesn't work out for them 3 months from now, a year from now, they should be able to have an option to come back. And sometimes the hard pill to swallow for, let's say, foster parents or even adoptive parents is that although you might see yourself as a plausible solution to support the young person might not see you as a solution, right? They might want to come back into the system to have support, but they might not want to come back to you specifically. So I think one of the learnings here and something that I push for is as parents, as guardians, as the support system to build a community of thriving young people, we need to be obsessed with the problem, not with the solution that you are the only solution out there. You have to be obsessed with the problem, because if you're obsessed with the problem, then you're going to do anything necessary and figure out different ways of solving the problem, whether it includes you or not, because the person at the center of everything is the young person themselves. And so for me, short answer is aging out needs to be erased and it should be replaced by however a young person wants to describe their experience, but systemically it needs to be replaced with a readiness system, so that a readiness framework, so that young people can, go on that journey to become ready and then make that decision to go in the community and be supported while they're in the community too, but also have a place to come back to if they're failing. And guess what? Humans fail. We're not perfect. And even if you're not institutionalized, there are people that move out and realize they're not ready to go on that journey yet, and they get to come back home. So what's going to happen to our folks? And that's why I'm not a fan of aging out. There's no such thing as aging out. At 18, you don't grow Superman cape. You're not like a warrior princess out there. No, you're still a human who comes from a history of trauma, which is often ignored. And so we know that developmentally, you might need a lot more time compared to your counterparts in order to become more ready. You might need more differential supports in place in order to thrive in the community as well. But short answer, like I said, eradicate that language and look at readiness and see it from a holistic, healing informed lens and framework and engagement, so that you are yielding the most optimal outcomes for each young person, depending on what their individual capacities and needs are.
Thank you. Thanks. This is why I like having you on. Your answers are so true and engaging. And I was going to say so many things to that, because you're right. I mean, if you look at maybe your neighbors or other friends, if they have a child, that child turns 18, it's not like, okay, see ya. Good luck, they're there, the family's there to support them or whatever, when that person is ready to leave, and it's their decision. The other point that I wanted to a friend, which I lost my thought, but anyway, good answer. Thank you. I'm sure it'll come back to me in a sec. So while I'm thinking of that, I'm going to move on to our next question. Okay. Okay. Oh, here it is. Sorry. So this month, so as you know, Adoption Awareness Month, November. So at Adopt for Life, we're focusing obviously on language. So a lot of our guests are coming on to talk about this. And then we're having a panel later in the month to talk about certain words. So, and the power of our words. So for our, we believe that in order to really understand, we have to listen. And listen to those with lived experience and including adoptees. I know you shared already a lot in terms of what our community, caregivers, parents can do to help that along. Any other specific or any other things you want to add to why the words we choose matter when we're talking about adoption or even permanency, like you mentioned in your first answer, what that really means, or in family in general?
Yeah, I think that in terms of, words itself, it all comes back to the reality that young people who are engaged with the child welfare system in any way possible, whether it's at a peripheral or really, as a Crown ward, for example, each young person has their own history of what brought them to that institution in the first place, right? That sector and system in the first place. And so for each person, some words can be triggering. Other words may not be triggering. What one word can trigger one person may not trigger somebody else. So it really goes back to the idea of really understanding and respecting the dignity and autonomy of each young person that comes into the system, and making sure that the supports and people that they engage with are respecting them as their own people, right? These are not little people. They're not just young people or youth. I don't use the word youth for a reason, because it kind of like portrays this reality, this perceived reality that they're less than, that they don't have full capacity to understand themselves. But honey, I could tell you one thing right now. Young people who have gone through a lot of trauma are a lot more wiser than their counterparts. So their age might be one thing, but their wisdom is another thing. And so for me, it just goes back to really getting to know each young person and their history, their trauma histories, so that you can inform yourselves in terms of what words you shouldn't be using, what words can be a place of trigger, what word should be a place of caution, what words you can work through with the young person to reclaim, for example. So when it comes to identity, right? When it comes to identity, some people, let's say, if you come from a culture where it's a norm to have anti-Blackness, and I'm not even talking about like the race, I'm talking about skin tone, colorism, pigmentocracy. The word Black can be very triggering for them, right? And a lot of people don't realize that, especially when it comes to like people who are not from the Black or brown or whatever community, or communities, I should say, because they're all diverse. And so even thinking about that one word Black, which is such a powerful word and something that I'm very proud of, in terms of just the word itself and the different meanings that it has in my life. Back in the day, that was a very different meaning for me. It was a place of trauma for me. And I would get triggered, when that word would be said or directed at me. And so how do you learn about the trigger points of young people? And then how do you also, according to their readiness to work on these things, be part of that journey, or not, or maybe it's not you that needs to be part of that journey as a guardian. Maybe you need to find somebody else who's more relevant to be on that journey with them, for them to heal, to be able to understand and be proud of the word Black, for example, right? So it really depends on the young person themselves. We can't really make blanket statements about one word, because one word can mean so many different things to so many different people. And I know this question is coming up later, but I'm going to incorporate this into this answer. For example, resiliency, I haven't used that term in 7 years, because it's an old school term and it's a buzzword now. It's overused. It's like a broken record. And the definition of resiliency means that a person is able to bounce back to their original form. But if you look at, human psychology and development, no one is able to go back to the initial, like, are you still the person that you were when you're 6 years old? No. Absolutely not. So resiliency in essence does not happen. It's not something that's practical. So the words that I use is agility, malleability, and adaptability. Is a young person agile? How can you improve their capacity to be more agile? Is a young person malleable? Are they able to adapt? How do you improve and capacity build for them to be able to navigate the different spaces and intersections that make up their identities, but then also the different environments that they are forced into, but also voluntarily go into? And how do you support young people to reconcile their identity with themselves? Because identity is a reconciliation process for a lot of young people in the child welfare system. And how do you reconcile how do you support a young person to reconcile with their past in order to move forward and work through those different spheres, right, in their lives, whether it's internal in their brain and the compartments that they need to visit, or externally, the different spaces that they need to visit physically. So for me, it's about making sure that we understand that each person has their own journey. It looks very different. And to know that, like, you know, some words should be kind of erased. Resiliency should be erased. Resiliency is so overused that it's become such a norm that everybody uses it. And now it's like, oh yeah, that's the word we need to describe young people. But it's not even about the word that's become a buzzword. It's about really understanding the definition of that term and asking yourself, is this what we believe humans are to be? Like, is this what we believe humans are like? And we know that that's not what humans are like. So kudos to the person who created that resiliency mind like lens, but it's old now. We need to move forward. And, you know, if a young person wants to call themselves resilient on their own, that's fine. But as a system, we should not be incorporating words and putting words in young people's mouths, thinking that those are the words that we need to describe young people as. So as a system, we need to understand that there should be boundaries and there should be caution in terms of how and what we use to describe young people. But if a young person learns on their own that, you know, this word resonates with them, then go by all and by means, utilize that word. It's very similar to identity, right? Like when it comes to us LGBTQ community members and the pronouns that they are, right? It's not how you identify, it's who are you? And if they identify at one point as a male, but then 2 months from now, they're like, actually, no, like I'm a woman, then you go with that. Who are you to question them? Same thing with young people from the child welfare system, right? Go with how they want to identify themselves. If there's something problematic that they're saying, like help deconstruct that with them, right? We're on a learning journey together. However, do not impose words and language on people, especially institutionalized people, because resiliency is an institutionalized word. When you use resilient, I think about institutionalized children. So do we want our children to feel institutionalized? No.
No, absolutely not. And thanks for that, because that word, you're right, it was a word that we were going to talk about later. And because you do see it and hear it a lot. And like you said, like if people want to continually learn and evolve, then they know that certain words do shift over time. Just like people change words, change, context of those words change. And maybe someone that doesn't have a history or a relationship with someone who experienced a child welfare system, they'll think that this is a compliment, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're that person and you're hearing this, or that young person is telling you back, you know what, I don't like that term because of X, Y, and Z. Part of unlearning and learning the shift of words is being open to being uncomfortable and hearing that and accepting it and starting to use new words, right? So I
really doing a reflective process as a system to stop using words and putting words in people's mouths, because at the end of the day, you don't call other children resilient. You call institutionalized children resilient. Guess what? It's an institutionalized word, so stop using it.
Love it.
It's simple to me.
Yeah. Okay. So if you're following along, stop using the term aging out and resilient. But other than that, other words shift and move. So keep talking to people, keep being open. And I think this goes back to what I was going to say before, and I had lost my train of thought about how whether you're a caregiver, a guardian, or maybe an adoptive parent, those roles are there because of the problem. And so if you want to help we should focus on the problem and not the solution. And I wanted to go back to that, and that was something you had mentioned earlier, but I think it's an important point to make and to say again. So especially the community that's listening to this, if you really want to move forward and make a difference, then start asking questions about why the system exists in the first place.
And that's the same type of paradigm and strategic direction of like the foundation that I work for, right, as an impact manager. And it's like we're not tied to any one solution. We're tied to the problem and solving a problem. And the same thing should be translated to how we interact and engage with young people, right? We need to be in love with the problem to figure out and be open-minded to healing informed solutions, whatever they may be, but also be agile enough to take risks, to try out different solutions that might be coming from the young person. And might they all work? Maybe not. But I think it comes with kindness and openness. And like, for example, the North Pine Foundation, we are grounded in kindness in everything that we do. And that's why it's easy to navigate different places and be able to say no sometimes when we realize that, no, you're in love with the solution, not the problem, So I think it needs to be translated on the ground in terms of whether it's engaging with young people or other people who are systemically violated. And that's the other thing too with terminology. I don't like using at risk. What the fuck is at risk? Sorry for swearing, but what the hell is that? There's no such thing as at risk. It's really about systemically violated, systemically oppressed populations. The system is the problem. The people are not the problem. So don't call people at risk as if like they put themselves there. The systems have, developed and nurtured the environments and the conditions necessary to push people into the barriers that they experience. And so I like to use the term systemically violated people, systemically marginalized people, systemically oppressed people, systemically failed people. That's what I like to say, because it puts the onus back on the system and asking the system, well, what are you going to do to eradicate this problem?
Well said. Well said. So, are there any other, like off the top of your head, any other words out there? Like seriously though, aging out, resilient, at risk. What are other words that we should just stop using?
Like vulnerable. Oh yeah, these kids are vulnerable. Why? It goes back to the same definition as at risk, right? Say it as it is. Who is the problem? The system. So they are systemically failed, systemically underserved, systemically overrepresented, like put the system at the front and then say that these young people are impacted by the system. They're not vulnerable because they were born vulnerable. The people that gave birth to them or adopted them did not adopt them because they came from a place of vulnerability or the family is vulnerable. The systems nurture the environments to have specific types of populations enter into poverty. The systems created that vulnerability. So the system in itself is vulnerable. The people are not vulnerable. So how do we take back that power and, elevate, amplify our voices in order to ask the system, well, you're the problem. So, fix it. So for me, it just goes back to reframing things properly and not just like scapegoating things and going the easy way route, because the easy way is often, the most accessible way. And the least accessible way is the one that requires more resources and money and supports, and less people are inclined to do that. I always say, like, as the impact manager for my work, my thinking is, the people who are the least supported are the people who need the most resources. The people who are most resourced probably need lesser resources, right? And so are we able to provide more resources where they need to go and not just like think about a one size fits all problem or solution that we want to go into. And same thing with words, right? So think about the types of words that have been developed or adapted into the child welfare system in order to describe the very people who are impacted negatively by these systems, by these sectors, by caregivers as well, right? And by families. And think about how do you reconcile that, deconstruct that, and shift the way in which you use language into using other words that are more reflective of reality. And the reality is that these are systematically and systemically violated, oppressed, marginalized, underserved populations.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope I'm doing okay with the answers. I'm kind of just winging it a little bit. Like I had an idea of what I want to say, but
are you kidding? You are like, anyway, you're killing it. So for you, what's the significance for you of having those with lived experience, people who were in the foster care system or they were adopted, share their perspectives and experiences, and how that can then shape or influence the language society uses? I know it's sort of like a thread that you've been addressing all.
Yeah. And one thing that I would say is we're not making space for perspectives, right? This is about people living their truths. And people don't need permission to live their truths. But the environment that we have nurtured, it's like people need permission to be themselves and to live out authentically in terms of what they're going through and speak openly about that. So I don't like the word perspective. It sounds voluntary. It's almost like, oh, like, give me your opinion. But these are not opinions. These are lives that people are living on a day-to-day basis, who are violated, who are systemically oppressed, who have a bunch of barriers, who have a lot of intersectional identities that systems violate or ignore altogether. And so for me, it's interesting. It's not about giving space, because giving means you're a savior. It's almost like you hold power. It's more about how do you nurture conditions so that people can be themselves authentically, speak their truth, and live their truth in these spaces. And without getting offended, if they speak their truth and it goes against what you think, it's not about you at the end of the day. So I think that amplifying truths are so important. And the more truths that are out there, and obviously in a very safe way, right? Because there's trauma involved and not everybody should be out there, saying things. So even keeping in mind what trauma and how trauma plays a role for the individual speaking, but also for other young people listening. But then also, how do you kind of nurture the conditions where people are able to equitably speak up and equitably talk about stuff and be able to, to be present in a space of such diversity of experiences and understand that different people have different experiences and expertise. And that's the other thing too. So one of the things, so back in the days, I used to say lived experience, because that was the language that the sectors utilize in homelessness, child welfare, et cetera. But then if you followed my work in a lot of like spaces like summits and conferences, I would tell people like, stop using lived experience or people with lived experience and start saying lived expertise, because these truths are just as valid as academic like data, right? Like this is value-based, meaningful data that is just as important as academia. And then, later on, about I would say 5 years ago, maybe, I started to say in different places, like, okay, we need to now shift forward and say, and when we're talking about leaders within these systems who have lived expertise, we should be calling them first voice advocates. And so even that language has evolved with my work, right? And I'm very proud to say a lot of people utilize first voice advocacy now and first voice advocates, and they're able to differentiate between leadership and lived experts who are engaging in those spaces as well. So that's also important. But I think in terms of voice, how do we create equitable voices? A lot of my work and a lot of my engagements with organizations has to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, but then also I incorporate, justice and reconciliation. And so in these spaces where we're nurturing the conditions where people can be themselves and live their truths and speak their truths, how do you make sure that all those different elements are also interwoven into those spaces as well? Because it's not only about speaking, it's also about connecting that to actionable items, and making sure that it's translated into policies, into program evaluations, into whatever is going on, because this is vital information that young people and first voice advocates and lived experts are imparting to you. You should feel privileged to be able to be imparted with that knowledge and that truth as well. So I think that it's not about making space. or asking for perspectives. It goes beyond perspectives. It's about normalizing these lives. It's about normalizing my truths. I come from the child welfare system, and there's certain things that I wouldn't talk about. There's other things that I would talk about, but normalizing spaces and normalizing just being, just to be, normalizing just being for people from these backgrounds, right? Because we matter. We're valid. We matter. And so if we matter, that means that we need to normalize our truths, and we need to live our truths. And so it goes beyond perspectives. It goes to just living.
That's great. Thank you. I learned a lot just now. Thank you. No, really, seriously, thank you. You mentioned something about if there are young people listening. So let's direct this directly to if there are any young people watching or listening to this right now, what advice would you give them in a society where we do wait to be asked to share a perspective? What do you tell those young people?
You know, like I said, my answers are never going to be blanket statements. I don't believe in that. Whereas a person like me, when I was young, I just said what I had to say and I lived my truth. And that took some reflection to get to that place when I was 16 or whatever. But that was a type of personality that I also had. Other people can utilize their wisdom and truth in other ways. You don't have to be at the forefront and in the limelight or spotlight or whatever. There are things that I do behind the scenes and talk about that no one knows about except for one or two people who I shared that truth with. And so it's really about asking yourself, you know, what does it mean for you to live in your truth? Does it have to be in a spotlight? No. Does it have to be behind closed doors? No, but you need to figure out what that process looks like for you, and how would you gauge the impact that you want to make or don't want to make? Like, what is your purpose of what you're doing as well? Because everybody needs to live their truth. Everybody needs to be able to navigate and be themselves, right? But the question is, how do you want to live your truth in terms of amplification? Do you want to be in the background? Like, it's kind of like politicians, right? The politician themselves is the face, but the brain is usually the analyst behind closed doors. So do you want to be like that silent person in the back doing a lot of work and utilizing your expertise and your first voice advocacy? Or do you want to be the face who is also doing a lot of work, but having their face out there? And something that I also want to caution is, you know, we need to be reflexive in terms of really thinking about what is the purpose of us in whatever decision that we make. Is it only individually benefiting us? Is it because we want to be in the spotlight, or is there a bigger purpose? And I would say go for the bigger purpose. It shouldn't be about you. It's not about me when it comes to OCAC. This is not the Cheyanne show. This is about, you know, improving and bettering systems for us, right? Because OCAC does a lot of systemic advocacy rather than individual stuff. And it's about really being bigger than who you are as an individual, being bigger than the group that you're a part of. This is about envisioning a future, right? For your future ancestors. I come from peoples who are, you know, indigenous or native to the northern part of Ilangay, which is the Tamil word for Sri Lanka. And for us, like, ancestry is very important. And for me, in terms of even from an identity lens, like, as a person who's Tamil from the child welfare system, I want my children, my future children, to know about my experiences and be proud of who I am and be proud of what I've been able to accomplish, but also understand the adversities that I've been through, right? And be able to live my truth that way. But having said that, I think that, you know, we need to open up spaces so that, or not open up spaces because that's the savior way of saying it, but we need to normalize storming spaces where people can just be and just live their truths. And our population, we're not conditioned to do that. We're conditioned to be silent or just be there when somebody asks us a question. But it's really about each individual's journey and trajectory in terms of how they want to utilize their voice. And some people may want to never identify publicly about being from the child welfare system, and that is their right. Do not force anybody to do that. Do not expect everybody to be a voice. They don't have to be if they don't want to be.
100%. I love normalize storming spaces. I'm going to leave it on that note.
Sounds good.
It was a privilege for me. So thank you for taking time to be on our Snack and Chat. It's really appreciated. I feel, or I know, that you are on always the cutting edge of words and language and developing that. So I'm always privileged to hear what you have to say on the subject. So for all of you watching, if you're watching on replay, you can add your questions and comments in the chat. We'll be checking in as the day progresses and get back to you if you have any specific questions for Cheyanne. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and follow us on Facebook, and then you'll know what's coming up in the weeks to come. Cheyanne, thanks again. I wish you all the best. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves, everybody. Bye.
Bye.